All right, so good evening, ladies and gentlemen and individuals. Thanks to those of you who are joining. I appreciate it. Welcome to our 16th and final workshop of holding government accountable for the spring 2022 semester. My name is Dr. Josh Franco, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Cuyamaca College. I appreciate y'all joining in. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we have on tap for today. So this workshop has been a series that's focused on how individuals inside and outside of government hold it accountable to the Constitution, federal and state laws, and regulations. This is a series of 16 30-minute workshops, and today is our last one. So over the past 15 weeks, we've covered a whole range of topics on accountability, from student power, local government, to Congress and oversight, to foreign policy, to interaction between the state and federal government, and holding different levels of government accountable. So today, our last topic is on the absence of accountability. And you might be intrigued by saying, well, why would you want to talk about that? I think it'll help bring kind of everything together if you've been following the series week after week. So let's go ahead and jump to that. And I'll post my slide from the current slide. Okay, so our learning objectives with this workshop are the following. First is to explain a world where there is an absence of accountability. Next is to describe how accountability vacuums are filled. Third is to identify how engagement by low propensity constituents can change the accountability matrix. And then lastly, explore a case study of accountability or lack thereof. So what's accountability? Well, it's the fact or condition of being held accountable, for being held responsible for something that's occurred. Now, when we think of accountability in a general sense, it's like basically the idea of responsibility. So for example, growing up, you had chores that were assigned to you by your parents. And if you didn't fulfill your chores, you were held responsible for them. Either, you got grounded, or you weren't able to go out with friends, or your allowance got deducted or taken away, or you weren't given your favorite foods, or you weren't given ice cream. In earlier times, there'd be more severe punishments. And then as we get older, we think of accountability in the sense of like, are responsible for doing well in college, or earning a living, paying our bills, providing for our families, and so on. So accountability kind of, in our minds, most of the times is this idea of responsibility. But when we think about it from a political science lens, we're thinking about accountability that's either electoral or non-electoral. So electoral accountability is basically through elections, and non-electoral accountability is not through elections. So let's go and unpack those a bit. So the idea of accountability existing, I think, is pretty straightforward. The idea of responsibility is pretty straightforward. And over the past 15 weeks, we've been talking about, how you hold different aspects of government accountable. But I like to bring up these questions of like, so, what if there wasn't accountability? Like, what happens? So what if we didn't have electoral accountability mechanisms? What if there weren't local elections? What if there weren't state elections? What if there weren't federal elections, right? This idea that we as individuals, as constituents, as voters can cast a ballot for someone or against someone. We can cast a ballot for an issue or against an issue at some degree of frequency, every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years. What if that wasn't available to us, right? I think the short answer to that question is, well, that's not a democracy. That'd be correct, right? When you don't have the ability to vote for someone into or out of office, you're not living in a democracy. You're not living in a representative democracy. You're not living anything near a democracy. Democracy at its core is about individuals being able to popularly participate in their selecting of who's going to create the rules, the laws, and going to enforce them in a city, in a county, in a province, in a region, in a state, across the country. So if we didn't have electoral accountability mechanisms, we wouldn't be living in a democracy. We would be living in an authoritarian or totalitarian state. It's basically where you have a single ruler or a single ruling party being able to decide who, what, when, where, how, and why all the time. Now, the other question is, well, what if we didn't have non-electoral accountability mechanisms? So things like protesting, right? Going out into the sidewalk and protesting, going out to the streets and protesting in front of government buildings or in front of corporate headquarters. The idea of petitioning, right? Being able to write a letter to your elected officials, to appointed officials, and sharing with them your thoughts, your ideas, your concerns, calling their offices, sending them emails, tweeting them, posting on Facebook and the like. So all those are under the umbrella of petitioning. Giving a public comment in a public forum. So say you want to go to a school board meeting to raise an issue about curriculum, or you want to go to a city council meeting and raise an issue about homelessness, or you want to go to a county meeting and raise an issue about public health, or you go to a state legislative hearing and you basically say you're for or against a bill that's being considered by the legislature. Those are all public comments, right? Those are all direct petitioning of the government in a public space and in a public way. And then the last potential non-electoral accountability mechanisms is like filing a lawsuit, is using the judicial branch of the government to hold other parts of the government accountable, either to existing laws or existing constitutional interpretations or existing standards. And so, the question is, well, what if we didn't have these non-electoral accountability mechanisms? Now, you could say, well, you don't live in a democracy. That would be more or less true. But what it also means is that you don't have another way of sharing your views, your thoughts, your opinions on matters, right? So when most of the times when we talk about accountability, people center on this idea of the electoral accountability mechanisms, like go and vote, right? This is an important thing that we should be doing. But then it's like, what do you do for the follow-up, right? What do you do in between elections? And this is where these non-electoral accountability mechanisms are really important. It's not just about saying I'm voting for somebody today and I hope they do what they say they're going to do. And if they don't, then shrug your shoulders and move on. It's really about saying, well, there's a constant or a consistent need to be constantly engaged in the political and the policy making process in order to continue to demand accountability. But if we didn't have either of these mechanisms, right, that would be the purest form of an absence of accountability, because there'd be nothing we can do about it. But luckily, we don't live in a totalitarian or a dictatorship in this country, right? We have both of these electoral and non-electoral accountability mechanisms at our disposal. And the idea is like, how do you exercise them? So in addition to these types of accountability, like this notion of an accountability vacuum. So the question is, when there is a vacuum of accountability, what political actors would seek to fill it? Now you might be saying, okay, wait, what do you mean by this? So imagine there's a space out there where no one is being held accountable for anything, even though you have electoral and you have non-electoral mechanisms. Now, in our case study that we'll see in a few minutes, we'll see an example of this, right? But the idea here is like, if there is a vacuum, who's going to fill that vacuum? It isn't going to be a vacuum forever, right? Somebody's going to see it and they're going to want to populate it. Most of the times, people who want to fill a accountability vacuum are the keepers of the status quo. These are individuals who benefit from, gain from, otherwise are happy with what's going on or how things are. And more specifically, those already in power. So you might be saying, what do you mean? I'm like, well, people who are currently elected officials at the local, state, and federal level, they'll fill the vacuum. So for example, you go to a city council meeting, or you're watching a city council meeting and they're voting on whether to subsidize a grocery store in a low income neighborhood or part of the city. And the vote goes 6-1, where 6 people say, no, we're not going to subsidize a private grocery store. And one person says, yes, we should. And presumably that one person who says, yes, we should, is representing that area. And they obviously have a need from it and hearing it from their constituents. So this question is being asked to the city council: do we fund or subsidize a private grocer to exist in a low income neighborhood or not? And most of the city council says, no, we will not. Now, you might say, well, where's the accountability in that, right? No one speaks up on the issue. Maybe most people don't even know it's brought because it was brought in the last minute. Or that people aren't aware of the long-term implications or downstream effects of that choice. So those in power will say no, because they want to put the resources to things in their area or their parts of the city. So those already in power benefit from it. So they want to keep the status quo, which is allocate resources here compared to there. Now, why will these political actors seek to fill this vacuum? Well, clearly because they want to sustain the status quo. If we are allocating resources every, let's say, month or every 6 months or every year as a body, whether it's at the local, state, or the federal level, you kind of like to be able to say the money's going to go over here compared to over there. And if no one's demanding that it goes over there, right, not in your area, not in your community, not in your part of the country, or not in your state, you're happy that no one's speaking up. You're happy that there's a vacuum because you just get to hang out there and keep doing what you're doing without any change. Additionally, these political actors want to fill this vacuum because it solidifies their power. When we in our country do not pay attention, when we're not engaged, when we're not involved past the election, right, the day after the election, the week after the election, the year after the election, up until the next election 2 years later, most of the time, or in different political offices 4 years later, or for U.S. senators 6 years later, right? If we're not engaged every day, or most every day, or at least once a week, or at least once a month, then those in power solidify their power. So this accountability vacuum, they exist, not in the whole sense, like there's no accountability, right, anywhere. It's just that it'll be vacuums in particular pockets, in particular spaces, on particular policy issues. And if people don't speak up electorally or non-electorally, then those in power, or those who want to keep things as they are, will work to sustain it and to solidify their power. Now, I'd like to introduce this concept of an accountability matrix just to kind of help visualize just the what I think is a simple or straightforward logic on the idea of accountability. So what you see here, let me get my pen, is our accountability matrix. And let me just draw a thing here. So on this part, or on, I'll call it the rows, row 1 and row 2, we have accountability that's lower. So I'll put a big L, or accountability that is higher. And then in the columns, we have the number of voters. And here we're saying that there's less or fewer voters. And here there's more voters. So if we have less voters, will we have accountability that's lower, or will we have accountability that's higher? And obviously I already have the check mark here, so the answer is given. But if we have less voters, we typically have less accountability. Now you might be asking, well, why is that the case? Well, when you have less voters, that means you have less people expressing their preference for candidates and for issues. And that means that the fewer voters might have more specific concerns that they're worried about, and that elected officials or non-elected officials are more responsive to. So in other words, less voters means there's less issues, and that means those fewer issues are going to be paid attention to more by elected officials, but in the whole, there'll be overall less accountability because you're not having the full range of issues being introduced, discussed, debated, deliberated, voted on, etc. So when you have more voters participating, you should typically have higher accountability. And the reason is pretty straightforward. When you have more people voting, they have more concerns that they're raising, and the people who get elected to office or are sitting in office or are bureaucrats in the government at any level are hearing these concerns. They are getting letters, they're getting phone calls, they're getting emails, they're hearing protests, they're seeing letters in the newspaper, and so on. And when there's enough concern raised, well, there has to be greater accountability. And some might say, well, what if nothing happens? Well, then this is where we turn to going from non-electoral mechanisms to electoral mechanisms and kind of playing this ping pong, right, given the season or given the year, given if we're in an election cycle or not. But in general, if there are less voters, there's less accountability. And if there are more voters, there's more accountability. Now, I want to make this model just a little more complicated in introducing this concept of what we call propensity voters. So here on the rows, again, we'll see accountability of elected officials is lower compared to accountability of elected officials is higher. And here now we're introducing not just voters in general, but we're bringing up propensity voters. And I'm bringing in what I call low propensity voters. Now you might be asking, okay, what's a low propensity voter? Well, low propensity voter is someone, let's say, who voted in 3 of the last 6 elections. Now, this is compared to someone who we call a high propensity voter, where they have voted in 6 of the last 6 elections. So you might be asking, okay, we'll give an example. So myself, I'm considered a high propensity voter. I vote in every election. So I've voted every election since 2004 when I was of age. And since then, I don't think I've ever missed an election. It's possible that I might have missed like one small local special election or something, or when I was moving from, Southern California to Middle California to Northern California to East Coast and back, that there might have been one or two elections I missed. But I'm pretty sure I voted in all of them. And so I would be considered a high propensity voter because I'm consistently casting using my electoral accountability mechanism to express my preference for candidates and issues. Now, a low propensity voter is someone who doesn't vote in every election. So it can be 3 out of 6 past 6 elections. It can be 1 out of 6. It can be 0 out of 6. So these people are registered to vote. They just didn't happen to cast their ballot this go around. So when we think about low propensity voters, the issue or the variable we're having is if there are fewer low propensity voters or a greater number of low propensity voters participating in an election. So if we have fewer low propensity voters participating, we would expect lower accountability of elected officials. And if we have greater number of low propensity voters participating, we would expect to have a higher accountability of elected officials. And the logic is the same, but the reason I bring up this idea of propensity is to kind of fix in our minds the idea that not everyone is always using their electoral accountability mechanisms to engage in the accountability process. And the idea is that if you're not engaging in the electoral process, it's probably the case that you're not engaging in the non-electoral processes as well. And so elections are one way we measure people's political engagement. And the hope is that if you have everyone's voting all the time, then that you're expressing the maximum amount of preference from the public or from the people, and that you have a maximum accountability by elected officials because they're always going to be concerned about what people are thinking because they're going to vote in very large numbers in the elections. Now, what I like to do next is go to a real world example. And this is a sad one that I'm going to bring up. It's about the tragedy in Uvalde, Texas. And I'm going to try to tread very cautiously or carefully through this, but I want to highlight this as an example that could be viewed as an absence of accountability. So I'd like to first start off with a tragedy that happened 10 years ago at Sandy Hook Elementary School. This is where dozens of people were murdered by somebody who clearly had issues and had access to high-powered or high-frequency or assault weapons. So what I'd like to do is play this short clip of then President Obama giving a short comments on this tragedy.
This afternoon, I spoke with Governor Malloy and FBI Director Mueller. I offered Governor Malloy my condolences on behalf of the nation and made it clear he will have every single resource that he needs to investigate this heinous crime, care for the victims, counsel their families. We've endured too many of these tragedies in the past few years, and each time I learn the news, I react not as a president, but as anybody else would, as a parent. And that was especially true today. I know there's not a parent in America who doesn't feel the same overwhelming grief that I do. The majority of those who died today were children. Beautiful little kids between the ages of 5 and 10 years old. They had their entire lives ahead of them. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, kids of their own. Among the fallen were also teachers, men and women who devoted their lives to helping our children fulfill their dreams. So our hearts are broken today for the parents and grandparents, sisters and brothers of these little children, and for the families of the adults who were lost. Our hearts are broken for the parents of the survivors as well. For as blessed as they are to have their children home tonight, they know that their children's innocence has been torn away from them too early, and there are no words that will ease their pain. As a country, we have been through this too many times, whether it's an elementary school in Newton, or a shopping mall in Oregon, or a temple in Wisconsin, or a movie theater in Aurora, or a street corner in Chicago. These neighborhoods are our neighborhoods, and these children are our children. And we're going to have to come together and take meaningful action to prevent more tragedies like this, regardless of the politics. This evening, Michelle and I will do what I know every parent in America will do, which is hug our children a little tighter, and we'll tell them that we love them, and we'll remind each other how deeply we love one another. But there are families in Connecticut who cannot do that tonight, and they need all of us right now. In the hard days to come, that community needs us to be at our best as Americans, and I will do everything in my power as president to help. Because while nothing can fill the space of a lost child or loved one, all of us can extend a hand to those in need, to remind them that we are there for them, that we are praying for them, that the love they felt for those they lost endures not just in their memories, but also in ours. May God bless the memory of the victims. And in the words of Scripture, heal the brokenhearted and bind up their wounds.
So that was President Obama 10 years ago, after the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. And when that happened, I was I had finished working in Congress. I was already back as a graduate student, and I was just like shocked and saddened by it, because they're just little children, and like, why does this even happen? And so now we know that there's been tragedies over the past 10 years. And yesterday's shooting in Uvalde, Texas, is just the latest one. And the New York Times has a map of the deadliest school shootings on record since that time. And this doesn't even include the non-school shootings that have happened. I mean, these are children, right? These are kids. These were us. For me, over a dozen and a half years ago. For others of you, it's probably just a year and a half, 4 years, 2 years ago when you're in high school. And it's tragic, to say the least. And so now that this has happened, right, we know there's been an accountability vacuum for the past decade. After the shooting in Sandy Hook, the president sought to pass legislation. It wasn't even offered a vote in the Senate, or at least a final formal vote in the Senate. And we had seen these tragedies accumulate over the past 10 years. So what I'd like to do is pull up an article of in Politico, which is a national newspaper, where former Congressman Beto O'Rourke from El Paso, who had run for Senate and lost just barely, and then ran for president but dropped out, who's now running for governor, came to the press conference of the current governor, Governor Abbott, who's here, to try to hold him accountable. So we'll go ahead and play this video. There might be a short. So let this ad go through really quick. So let the clip play, and then we'll have a couple of these paragraphs of the news article itself read to us. Okay.
Excuse me. Excuse me. Excuse me.
Sit down.
You're out of line and an embarrassment.
Sit down and don't play this stuff.
Next shooting is right now, and you are doing nothing.
No, he needs to get his ass out of here. This isn't the place to talk this over.
This is totally predictable when you.
Sir, you're out of line. Sir, you are out of line. Sir, you are out of line. Please leave this auditorium. I can't believe you're a sick son of a bitch that would come to a deal like this to make a political issue. It's on assholes like you. Why don't you get out of here?
So that was Beto O'Rourke confronting the governor and basically saying, you know, you haven't done anything, and now look what's happened. So I'm going to go ahead and play the next video, which is, so the former congressman, he left and was outside of the auditorium, and he spoke with the media again.
He talked about that this was evil. The only thing evil is what he continues to do to the people of this state. He says this was unpredictable. It was totally predictable, and I predict this will continue to happen when you continue to have a governor who will not stand up for the people of Texas. He came to my hometown of El Paso after 23 people were slaughtered. He said he was going to do something. He did nothing. In fact, the only thing he did was make it easier to buy a gun. The only thing he did was make it easier to carry a gun in public. And he bragged about the fact that there would be no background check, no training, no vetting whatsoever. He's scheduled to speak at the NRA convention this Friday in Houston, Texas, just days after these kids were slaughtered right here in Uvalde. After they were slaughtered at Santa Fe High School, at Sutherland Springs, in Midland, Odessa, in El Paso, Texas. 5 of the worst mass shootings in U.S. history right here in this state in the last 5 years. He was governor for every single one of them. And after every one of these, he holds a press conference just like this. And I wish to hell, when he came to El Paso, someone would have stood up and held him to account and confronted him and shocked the conscience of this state into doing something, because if we do nothing, we will continue to see this.
So a very heartfelt and emotional post, you know, or at least speaking to the media. And that last part is what I want to highlight for the context of our conversation here. You know, saying somebody has to hold him to account, right? And that's what he's trying to do. He confronted him in public. He's running for governor against him. And he's making it known that the incidences and the events that have happened in Texas have all been during that governor's watch. And so when we think of like, is there an absence of accountability, right? So a couple articles I'll point out, but I won't get into them, is like from NPR, National Public Radio, the U.S. once had a ban on assault weapons. Why did it expire? And then just this evening, after Congressman O'Rourke spoke at that press conference, how in the Washington Post, how the governor of Texas is getting basically put back on his heels on this issue. And I'm going to go ahead and go into reader mode, and I'll have the first few paragraphs of this article read to kind of give a little bit of context.
Weakened gun laws put Texas Governor Greg Abbott on the defensive. Democratic gubernatorial nominee Beto O'Rourke challenged Texas Governor Greg Abbott on Wednesday at Uvalde High School as Abbott was defending his handling of gun laws, Sergio Flores for the Washington Post. Amid a spate of mass shootings in recent years, Texas Governor Greg Abbott responded by focusing on promoting mental health services and convening a task force that produced a 40-point plan centered on hardening school campuses and identifying threats. But in the wake of the worst school attack in state history, Abbott is facing mounting criticism that his administration's response has been inadequate and failed to deal with the most urgent problem: easy access to guns, including powerful assault rifles. The massacre at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde on Tuesday that left 19 students and 2 teachers dead was the 4th mass shooting in Texas with 10 or more fatalities since 2017. Yet as Abbott sought to reassure the public Wednesday that his administration is doing all it can to respond to the crisis, he sought to deflect blame for not doing enough to keep students safe.
So this article goes on to describe, this back and forth of what's been going on in Texas and the leadership. And the idea is, will there be an absence of accountability, right? And people can argue the semantics, or they can argue the specifics. They can argue this was a lone wolf, this was a troubled person. They can argue that, something else should have been done or could have been done. But if we're thinking about living in a representative democracy like the United States, who else do we hold accountable but our elected officials, and but the appointed officials, and but the non-elected officials who run the government, who are responsible for executing the laws of the land, who are responsible for hearing the concerns of the public and addressing them through policy. And so this is an open-ended question, and it's tragic that this happened. And it makes me, as I called my congressman's office this afternoon, I said, 10 years ago in Sandy Hook, when this happened, I wasn't a parent. Like I was just engaged. I was starting a new part of my life, but I didn't have a kid. And now 10 years later, my son's going to be starting school in August. And for the next 12 years, right, I have to worry about something like this happening. And that's just not right, right? Something needs to be done, and people need to be held to account, and not just being in one state or the other state, right? There needs to be action at all levels, because this is an endemic problem across the country. And so with that, the absence of accountability, right? There are other examples I could bring up, but this is the most relevant, the most pressing, and I think the most touching for every family and for every parent in the country. And so with that, I appreciate you taking the time to listen in. I'll go ahead and move us to the discussion, so I'll stop the recording. But with that, it's been a privilege and an honor to go through these 16 workshops on this topic, and I look forward to seeing how things roll out over the next few years on a range of these issues. But at the end of the day, know that you have the power to shape the actions of the government. You have the power to vote, you have the power to petition, you have the power to protest, you have the power to speak up, and you have a power of sharing your opinion, because in this country, the First Amendment, right, your free speech is what comes first. So with that, thanks so much and take care.